Now that we have our table, our pivot table from the main data, and we have organized this pivot table and played around with it, you'll see that I have selected the pivot table here. And if I want to click on this little pin icon, as long as I have a cell in the pivot table, I hit edit and I can access the pivot table editor. Now that's what we watched in the previous video. And right now we are concerned with trying to make sense of this data and looking at some visuals that we can also, that'll help us understand what this data means and also help us share our findings when we come to those conclusions. So to do this, we will want to make sure that we've selected a cell within the pivot table. And then we're just going to come up here and easily just click insert and insert chart. Now the chart will go on our spreadsheet here, and it's actually a different element. Let's go ahead and move it down a little bit. You can click and drag this wherever you need. You can obviously make it bigger and smaller based on what you're working with. And you notice that this has a lot of different information that we need to play with in order to make a little bit more sense out of this. So let's go ahead and look at what examine what we're looking at here. And we have our chart editor here over on the right, and there's two parts to this chart editor: the setup, which is how we're using the data from the table and visualizing it on our axes here on our graph. And then we have customize, and this customizes the chart and how it appears. So we want to start with the setup first to make sure we have the data and that we're trying to manipulate the different settings and to arrange the variables and the values and compare those values to make any meeting. So we can look at chart type here. You can change the chart type as you want, and some chart types really don't make any sense with the data, so obviously you don't want to pursue that particular chart. Here's a combo chart comparing different datas and different trends. Let's just go ahead and go back to what it provided. It also suggests different ones based off of the patterns that you provide in your data. So let's go ahead and select the one that they defaulted to. You can do stacking. This is really just pretty detailed aspect of it. So let's just go skip over there. Here's our data range. That's just the table. All right, and then we can say aggregate. Now we've already really aggregated the data through our table. So this is not super important. You can see if I click on this, it doesn't really do a whole lot. It gives me this, but it's obviously already an average. So we don't really need to aggregate this data off of the table. Now, we can also come down here and manipulate these tick boxes and these features to change some of the data that's being read. Now, as I did that, you'll notice that there was the series, and that's the raw data that it's bringing in and obviously aggregating. So it's a series of aggregations from the table. And if we want to remove one, okay, let's say we don't want to have this one, we just remove it. Okay, that whole variable disappears, or that whole series. I'm going to undo that. So I have my 4 categories, or my 4 series here. And now we can take a look at where these are appearing. So we have a title here. Here is our key, and you'll notice that right now the color, bar color, is being grouped by the title of our questions, basically. So with this type of chart, we can compare within a class. Now we can see grade 6. Grade 6 is the grouping variable, and the grouping variable appears on the bottom here, and that's the x-axis. And so you can go ahead and manipulate this as you want with these series. Again, going back within the class though, this sort of answers a question of how does the class compare with itself? So within the class, how can we look at the different responses? So we can identify perhaps an outlier, and then we can address those outliers in some conclusions. Now, obviously, these are just the class. And if I want to, and then the general grand total, so you can see how the overall classes compare, or overall within all the classes compare. All right, let's go back to setup. And now with this, we can answer the question again. how does a specific class feel in relation to each of the four series of data, or four different responses within the class? So we can just easily compare within the class, and also you can compare between classes, but that's a little bit more difficult because we're trying to make a jump. Now, the other question we can ask, and we'll have to do a little adjustment, we can switch the rows and columns and how it reads within the table, and that'll change our chart, and it'll provide us with a different option of comparison. So I'm going to come down here and click on this tick box, and now we have switched the x-axis. So the x-axis is reading just within the question, and our comparison within the question here is the grades. So you can see grade 8, grade 9, and grade 10, and then the grand total. So you can see how students from each of the different classes compare to each other. So in this particular configuration, how do the classes compare with each other within each question? And then this would help us answer, how do whole classes responses compare for each of the four series of data or the four different questions? And we can easily see within the classes, or between the classes within each of the questions. And so that's one way of visualizing the data and sort of making comparisons among the results or the collection of this data. Now, just as a side note here, you can see that we have a variable that's grand total, and that may not be something that we really want. So we can actually change this graph by going back to our table and just coming up here, and I can change the title, so I can clean this up a little bit. We already know it's averages, and we're going to be talking about that in our conclusions, but we already know that, so we can clean it up a little bit to make it appear a little bit cleaner for our explanation purposes and analysis purposes. So I just come up here and I just click here. All right. Now, eventually, this chart will take on these new titles, and this will be cleaned up. Sometimes it doesn't. Now, if I don't want a grand total in this, I can actually come over here. Now that I have cleaned this up, I can hit edit, and then I come over here, and under the rows in our pivot table editor, I can just say don't show totals, and when I say that, it removes it from the pivot table, but it also removes it from the chart, making the chart a little bit better. Now, obviously, we've already adjusted the titles for each of our columns. We want to make sure that's in there, and so we can just go in here and we can actually edit the table itself. Okay, this is just a title, but you can see down here on the x-axis that it is drawing in the title. So if I come over here and I say CCCC, you can see that it changes the x-axis title, not necessarily the title of the graph, which we can change in a customize. That'll be another video. But for right now, let's just go ahead and undo that, and you can see that I have a much cleaner looking graph now and comparing the different classes within each question. And that is all we need to do with our graph. And so now we have figured out how to take from pivot tables to graphs, and then also manipulate the different variables and how they're appearing through the setup feature of the chart function. And that is how we can use the pivot tables to create our graphs and edit our graphs. Thanks for watching.